Hello, hello, hello. Anyone out there listening or watching, if you could let us know if you can hear us all right, that would be really useful. The last couple of weeks I've had a little bit of trouble at the very start knowing if anyone can hear us or not. So if anyone's out there, let us know. Boom. Robot Man again. This guy honestly is on every week. Hey Robot Man, can you let us know if you can hear us all right on the live stream? That would be really useful. I want to make sure that this week there is no technical difficulties whatsoever. That would be really useful. Let's just see on the chat. To confirm, I can hear you. Great. All right, well, we'll crack on and get straight into it. So everyone, thanks for joining us on the live stream and for the podcast. For those of you who don't know, this is Jack Talks To. It's podcast and live stream. It's very early stage of this podcast. It's episode 5. The podcast is all about having a free-form, unedited conversation with guests, friends of mine, from all walks of life to share an interesting experience or knowledge or perspective on something which I'll find interesting and I hope you find interesting as well. And this week I'm joined with Oonagh Ryder. How you doing, Oonagh? You all right?
Good, thanks. Yeah.
Good. Is this your first live stream experience? Because you've done a lot of podcasting before.
Yeah, I've done a lot, but it's not live.
Yeah.
I record it and then I edit it.
Yeah.
And I take out all the stupid stuff I say.
Yeah.
So this is my first live thing.
Well, luckily for us, there'll probably only about 3 or 4 people watching the live version.
Great.
So it's all about the podcast here. But thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. I'll just introduce yourself for everyone who's listening. Oonagh, you spent the last 5 years working in the voluntary sector in the criminal justice, and you're currently working as an admin and research assistant for a small charity that supports pregnant women and new mothers in prisons and in the community. Alongside our friend Sam Swann, you also host The Lockdown, a podcast about prisons and the criminal justice system on Novara Media. So how long have you been doing that podcast for?
We started it in November last year, so a few months.
And how many episodes are there?
I think 13 at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're just gearing it for the next season of them?
Season 2 is coming in September, hopefully.
Great.
Haven't recorded any of it yet, but that's the plan.
Yeah, amazing. Right, I'm just checking the stream here, see if we're good. We're good. We've got 3 people watching. Great.
Amazing.
Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. So this week is all about, is it time to get rid of prisons? And this is a subject which I find really interesting. I don't know a huge amount about it, which we're probably going to find out during this conversation. But obviously with your background, Oonagh, you're someone who's quite well educated on the matter. Just before we get into things, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, about how it is you got involved in this debate, in this topic.
Yeah, people ask me this a lot because obviously all I do is go on about prisons.
But it's quite niche. I mean, this is an interesting thing.
Yeah. And I've not got that much of a good answer. Normally you'd think someone would be like, oh, I've got a family member in prison,
Sure.
or, I've had this experience. But I think for me, probably started off by becoming involved in activism. So when I was at university, I was involved in a movement called Climate Camp.
Right.
Which there was a lot of police surveillance. And I was arrested just once, nothing. I was just literally on a protest, got arrested, and was in a cell for 6 hours, and then.
So how long ago was this?
2009.
Okay. And how old were you then? So.
I was 22.
Okay.
21, maybe 20. I don't know. Around there.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was fine. I wasn't, it wasn't the worst thing ever. But being in that cell and having that experience with the police and being in a situation where they don't give a shit about you and how scary that is, and
Sure.
to be at the mercy of those people, that kind of got me thinking this is terrible.
Sure.
And kind of the violence that we would experience on protests or on direct actions, and then kind of taking that away and thinking, oh, well, imagine if you live with this violence all the time.
Sure.
And me as a white middle class person,
Yeah.
I haven't lived with that violence, but that was my introduction.
That is that's not that boring a story. That's actually quite good. So obviously you had an experience getting arrested, which I suppose a lot of people haven't had that similar experience. That's what really sort of galvanised you into I guess, exploring the subject a little bit more and getting involved in the debate a little bit. So that was way back. So that was
that was when I was at university, and I studied sociology. So kind of like I studied like societal inequalities and the prison system a little bit. And then when I left uni, I volunteered us a little while for what's called an appropriate adult. Yeah. Which is like a great title for a role. But what that means is that anyone who's under 17 who gets arrested, or an adult who might have learning difficulties or a mental health problem, they legally have to have what's called an appropriate adult there with them in the police interview.
Right, okay.
And normally that will be like a parent or a social worker, but sometimes they don't have anyone who can come. And so they have a team of volunteer appropriate adults to go in case that happens.
So the appropriate adults would they be called by the police or by a sort of a middle party?
They'd be called by the police, and as I said, normally like a parent or something. But in areas, basically like when they don't have someone to come for them, social services will arrange something, or like there's areas where it's charities. So I was working for a charity doing that, and that meant that I met a lot of people in the police station. I was doing it over 2 years in Lewisham Police Station. Met a lot of people at that crisis point of being arrested, and I experienced how the police treated them even in front of me.
That's
and that
insane.
was really shocking for me.
Just before we go any further, we have just a little bit of hygiene. The table if we tap the table, it goes to the microphone. So we've got to basically just be a little bit. Don't worry. The first the first episode, I was like banging it. I was like, putting my hands all over the place. So you'll notice I put my beer down like this. I'm like, gently. Do you mind me asking? So was that a paid position, being a?
No, that was a voluntary role.
So that's totally voluntary. Yeah. I mean, and you did that for how long? Sorry.
I did it for 2 years. Yeah. Not like full time. I did like 2 nights a week. Yeah.
God, you must. And it was usually that kind of time frame in the night time.
Yeah, well, I would do the evening shifts, so because
that's
I was
very
working
commendable.
Daytime.
I bet you must have seen some some pretty interesting scenes down like the police station at that time of night.
Definitely, and like the people that I met, because they were either kind of what's called a vulnerable adult, or they would be a child, were just in horrific situations, and I could see that the way they were being punished by the system for whatever had happened, and the way they were being treated was very, very punitive. And I would go into the police station and meet someone who was like literally suicidal, and trying to get a police officer to give a shit about that was almost impossible. Was that quite
did you have any training in that role? As in, like, to deal with the police, to deal with the individuals that you're helping?
Not enough training. I don't think we had training. And it's a role that I'm quite sceptical about now. I think I would struggle to go back to it.
Right. Why is that?
I think because of the lack of training, the lack of kind of status you have in that role, it's very hard to challenge the police. So you often feel like you're kind of working with them. It's like placating that person, making their jobs easier.
Yeah.
And you're obviously not a lawyer. Like sometimes you'll be sitting in on police interviews and you're kind of expected to intervene if the person doesn't understand the questions. And I didn't always feel equipped to know like how and when to do that.
God, that is unbelievable. I'm trying to picture myself if I could handle myself in that sort of situation, and I can imagine the first time you. It must be a bit of a baptism of fire getting involved in that kind of. That environment in that world.
It can be a little bit, and not really because of the people who are detained in the police station, but more because of working with the police and the kind of attitudes that you come up against in those situations, and trying to really be an advocate for someone that the police really aren't interested in hearing about or from.
Wow.
So that kind of cemented my interest in it, I think.
So from that point on, so you're spent 2 years, and this is obviously on the sideline as a volunteer. When did you start working essentially full time within the sort of the prison sector?
I've kind of had various jobs like in the charity sector, and I've never really done frontline work, so I'm not gonna like pretend that I have that kind of expertise. It's all been kind of admin, program support, project support, like policy work in various different charities. So I worked for a bit on like a Home Office led youth crime prevention program. I worked for a little while for a very small charity in Leeds that supports men when they come out of prison. And then I was working in policy in another charity, kind of working sort of with the Ministry of Justice, or acting as a critical friend to the Ministry of Justice to advocate for the voluntary sector.
God, that's amazing. I'm just gonna take 30 seconds out. I'm just gonna test our stream to make sure that we're all good in the hood. Bear with us, guys. 1 minute. This is the things we have to do during the live stream because we're totally live. I just have to constantly make sure that we're doing all right on the technical front. I wish I had an assistant at this point. It'll be great.
You can work your way
So
towards
yeah,
that.
well, this is it. I mean, so don't feel I'm being rude when I'm sort of checking laptop and phone while you're
Okay.
mid sentence. So just give me 10 seconds before we check this. Bear with me. We're good. We're so good. By the way, guys, anyone out there who is listening to the live stream, by all means, feel free to ask any questions for Oonagh while she's here. Yeah, we're getting... Look, check your mic, Jack. We're sounding good, guys, on my end. Sorry, let me check the headphones here. Oh my God, we're sounding so good. So, yeah, guys, ask any questions for Oonagh while she's here. Anything about the prison system, anything that you feel like her experience would be able to answer your questions. So, getting on to sort of the topic at hand, the topic of this is it time to get rid of prisons? And it's quite a provocative title because I guess this all sort of relates to something that you're extremely passionate about, which is prison abolition, right? So for those that don't know, just give us a top line sort of definition of what is prison abolition.
So there's two sides to prison abolition. One is the kind of basic idea that you would expect, which is dismantling the prison system. And that's because abolitionists view the prison system as inherently harmful. We think it's a violent system to be caging people, and we recognise that those people who are locked up are usually people who have experienced the most difficulties in life, and people who are kind of really at the sharp end of our economic system, and the people who are most affected by racism, for example. Right. But the flip side to prison abolition, aside from kind of dismantling that system that is harmful, the flip side is probably more important. The flip side is about building. So actually abolition is really about kind of building a society that doesn't feel the need to rely on prisons. Right. So, and this bit is really, really broad. So it might be things like having a society in which everyone has somewhere to live. Right. So like a big factor in people going to prison is becoming homeless. Right.
When they come out of prison?
When they come out and before. So like a thing that will bring people into prison because of the difficulties that are associated with being homeless and because of the ways that we criminalise homeless people. So, for example, you can get an ASBO, an antisocial behaviour order, for things like leaving your sleeping bag out on the street or being in a particular area of public space. Right, okay. And then once you have that antisocial behaviour order, it means if you break it, so the police might say, okay, you can't come and beg in this spot again. Right. And then if you break it, you come back, then you've committed a criminal offence and then you can get pulled into the prison system. Aside from that, things like reforming the education system and making education more widely available. Another thing that we know is strongly correlated with imprisonment is exclusion from school. And also providing mental health support for everyone. I think it's pretty well aware there's a mental health crisis in this country and a crisis of the services. So providing that support that people need so they don't get to the point of maybe doing something harmful. So
I'll interrupt there. So just on that little point there, where it's we have a crisis in this country with the services that are in place at the moment, is the whole idea of prison abolition a response to that crisis? What I'm trying to get at here is, would we have prisons, at the start of the evolution of our society, or is it something that has come as a result of a need to fix a crisis, in your opinion, not the best way possible?
Well, the history of the prison system is very interesting, and I don't think there's much awareness of it. I think we kind of think of prisons as this institution that's always been around. It's kind of timeless. And
yeah, I want to get into this. Like how? So this is quite interesting. I think it'd be good for anyone listening. Like, take it back to. I mean, like, if you like, what's the genesis of prisons in a bit of a nutshell? Because I don't know anything about. Because I always thought, yeah, we've always had prisons. Of course, you do something wrong, you get locked up.
I mean, we've always, not always, but like for hundreds, thousands of years, we've had like areas where you might lock someone away. And particularly kind of in the medieval period, it would be for things like not paying your debt, or you would be locked up maybe before you experience what would be a very like bodily painful punishment, like hanging or like being dismembered. I'm not advocating that we go back to that, but it's just to point out that this idea of imprisonment as a standardized kind of national response to committing crime is actually really recent. So we didn't have a national prison system until like the early 1800s.
Are you kidding me? We didn't have a prison system until the 1800s?
Not a national one.
Right.
So like there would, in local areas, there might be like local jails, but like this idea that kind of, you know, wherever you are, if you transgress, if you break the law, you're at risk of going to prison is very, very recent. It's a few hundred years old.
Yeah.
And where that comes from actually is even more interesting. So development of the prison system was very much in response to particularly resistance to colonialism.
Right.
So you find things like in Jamaica, the idea of a national prison system was starting to be experimented with 50 years before we had it in the UK, and that was in a bid to keep the slave trade in place.
Right.
So as a punishment for runaway slaves.
And that was a massive thing, I think, and my history isn't great here, but even at the when they got rid of slavery in America, they used the prison system to sort of indentured servitude, where it's basically just arrest people and still put them back to work in exactly the same system as the sort of slavery. Yeah. So I thought it's the same principle there as well. Yeah,
really a way to kind of manage resistance to colonialism and capitalism. So again, you see it in India as a response to rebellions from the Indian people.
Right.
And you know, but if you look at our policing system in so Robert Peel, who's kind of hailed as the founder of the Metropolitan Police, before he did that job, he was the sorry, I've got it written down, the chief secretary for Ireland. So he was kind of managing the colonial government in Ireland, and at a time of massive resistance, and figured out that actually what's more efficient than having to bring the army in every time there's a resistance is to have this generalized surveillance and control of people.
And that's the police, or is that prisons?
So that was how policing was developed.
Right, okay.
And, you know, I very much see policing and prisons as kind of like necessary for each other.
Sure.
And then we saw that kind of model of policing brought back to the UK to then deal with workers' uprisings against the implementation of capitalism. Because we have to remember that also the form of capitalism that we have now is similarly recent. Those things kind of developed at the same time.
Right.
So I guess from an abolitionist perspective, one of the points is to say prison has never been about rehabilitation. It's never been about making society better or caring for each other. It's always been actually about putting down rebellion and kind of sweeping away those people who become inconvenient to capitalism, either because they're resisting to it or because they've been kind of made disposable by it.
That is fascinating. So just so I'm sort of breaking it down for the sort of the jackisms in my head. So essentially, it was a form of controlling people who resisted a capitalist structure that was basically where our society was evolving around over the last few centuries. It almost reminds you of the same principle as the way that drugs have been criminalised, particularly, I don't know so much about the UK, but in the US, over particular minorities. It was almost like, well, the law had nothing to do with the actual drug itself. It had to do with the people that were effectively using this drug. And that was the form of suppression they were using in terms of criminalising drug use.
Yeah.
So is it kind of like a similar sort of principle with that, sort of suppressing people who were resisting the government, so to speak?
Yeah, so what's very interesting about the history of prisons is that as the use of prison becomes more standardised and more state-led, you also see this development of the idea of the criminal.
Yeah.
Which was kind of less of a prominent idea in culture before kind of around the 1800s. And this is after the Enclosure Acts, kind of through the 17 and 1800s, which forced people off the land they were living on and forced them into wage labour. And what that did was create a kind of class of people who could be viewed as disposable or had kind of been disposed of by the system, who were landless, were struggling to feed themselves, were kind of going around trying to find work and trying to find wages, and would often be kind of like forming in places in groups and like causing trouble for the administration or like the powers that be. And so what you see develop is this idea of the criminal who is kind of already predisposed to committing crime and being harmful and is kind of already dangerous. And it's used as a way to kind of blame these people who have been put in such an awful situation by this new economic system, kind of for their own downfall.
Right, I see. That is amazing. I mean, it's so funny. I mean, I always just kind of, when I think about, as a layman who doesn't know much about this at all, when I think of prison systems, I literally just think that kind of, from the history of it, the sort of Victorian era, sort of jail cell, like very quick, like, capital punishment being sort of like, you get into prison, it's a downward spiral, no sort of rehabilitation. It's sort of like lock them up, throw away the key, so on and so forth. So hearing the whole point of this kind of anti-government sort of perspective on things is quite amazing for me. In terms of sort of bringing it to like modern day, so I always think about prisons as being, obviously not great places, but what we get from sort of like the media is this whole word of rehabilitation, okay, which is obviously massive for prisons. Now, the way I'm just going to tell you how I see it, and you just tell me how wrong I might be. So I would see it that certain prisons and certain crimes that are committed by individuals, they would then receive, but part of going to prison is part of their rehabilitation. Essentially, they're being punished for a crime that they've done, and while they're inside, they'll get 3 square meals a day. They'll get certain resources like training, or they'll do something to help them better their lives when they get out of prison. That's part of their rehabilitation. And as the government would have it, never want to commit a crime ever again. So that's kind of like my overarching view of the prison system. What how wrong am I there? And like essentially, or if anything, what is fundamentally, what is wrong with prisons? Like, why are they not a good thing at the end of the day? I know that's probably the biggest question you're probably going to get, but it's just interesting because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening and watching going like, oh, I mean, it's interesting actually. So yesterday when I told someone that I was going to do this podcast, I said, oh yeah, I'm getting my friend Oonagh on. We're going to talk about getting rid of prisons. And the first thing he said, it was like, what do you mean get rid of prisons? Like, what? So everyone's just running around, criminals are just running around left, right and centre. And it's that thing where it's going, well, I don't think most people can even imagine a world without prisons, or they see prisons as a good thing. Yeah. Why would we want to get rid of them? So going back to the question, fundamentally and sort of top line, what is fundamentally wrong with the prison system?
Yeah. So if you start by just taking the system on its own terms. Okay. So this idea that prison is kind of supposed to do two things. It's supposed to deter people from committing crime by punishing, making examples of people, and it's supposed to rehabilitate people. So there's no evidence that it works as a deterrent. There's no correlation between kind of levels of prison population, levels of crime.
Really?
No one's ever managed to prove. And deterrent, I think, is quite...
Do you mind if we just go into that? So there is no concrete evidence to suggest that an individual who is willing to commit crime will be deterred by the fact that they will be put in prison if they get caught.
So it will depend on lots of different factors.
Yeah.
On the individual, there's also there's things to suggest that, for example, the certainty of punishment is actually more of a deterrent than what the punishment actually is. So if you know that like you for sure will be punished, that's more of a deterrent than like the possibility of going to prison.
Right.
But all this stuff is very muddy. So what is true is that no one's managed to link kind of levels of prison population and levels of crime.
Right. I see.
To kind of draw a causation between those two things.
Yeah.
Also, this idea of deterrent is really, really difficult because what's a deterrent to one person might not be a deterrent to another person, and particularly, one person might have a lot to lose, one person might not have that much to lose.
Sure.
So there are examples of, for example, homeless people committing crime in order to get into prison.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Like, you have some people who go like, and it's probably the rhetoric of, sort of people who don't probably know that much, but like, these prisoners are getting treated so well in prison, they're getting all this meal playstations, mobile phones, like some of them want to get arrested to just go in prison because it's so cushy. So that, that kind of opinion, I'm sure, is you hear quite a lot.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, we can probably go into that in more detail
Sure.
in a little bit. But I mean, my personal opinion is that's an indictment of our own society, like out in the community.
Yes,
if
okay.
we're really saying that it's better in prison
Sure.
than out here, I don't think that says prison is great. I think that says out here is really appalling for certain groups of people.
Sure.
But just to come to the rehabilitation thing
Yes.
as well. So the reoffending rate is 49% within a year. 49% of people reoffend within a year of leaving prison.
Whoa.
And that statistic goes up. Obviously, like if you go on 2 years or like 3 years or 4 years, that statistic also goes up if you're looking at young people. And that's been pretty steady, like more or less since prisons have been invented.
I was just about to ask, yeah. So that's a very current one, and once again, this is probably a whole video in itself, but why? What are sort of top line reasons for that reoffending? Like with the
the impact of prison on your life is
Right.
is disastrous. So
Okay.
I think it's around about 50% of people will lose their jobs when they go into prison. Many people lose their homes. About a third of people lose contact with their families. So
Sure.
you come out of prison often jobless, homeless. When you leave prison, you get £46 and you get nothing else.
When you leave prison, you get £46.
That's
What,
your
a week?
discharge grant.
You get that a week when you get out of prison.
That's it. It's a one-off payment.
You get £50 when you leave prison, and potentially without a job, without a home, without anything, you go, right, this is the £50. That's it.
See, yeah. You might be, depends on the area they're
Sure.
in. You might be lucky. There might be like services that can support you. But yeah,
You kind of have. I have that as a filmer. I can have that image of that kind of classics. The guy steps out of prison, and then like his partner's there, like to pick him up, like in the car or whatever, and they go there. And but that's quite rock and roll. But £50, like with the potential of an individual having nothing after that point.
Yeah.
That's why I guess 50% reoffending actually, kind of makes a lot of sense, really.
you can't get signed up to benefits while you're in prison. And then when you get out, it takes you 6 weeks to get your benefits. If you manage to get signed up straight away, which can be difficult because people often don't have addresses.
Sure.
People might not be in the right state to be able to get to the job centre, particularly on their own. So that first 6 weeks out of prison can be really dangerous for people, and not just for reoffending, for like things like suicide risk, self-harm, because the impact on mental health of coming out kind of destitute and usually with a significant amount of trauma from the time you spent inside. It's kind of like you're in the worst possible situation.
Let me ask you: Is this like is this like kind of like for prisons up and down the country, or is this like one or two particular prisons which are like this harsh? Are they all pretty?
Like how terrible
Well,
they
just
are.
exactly.
Yeah, so they're all pretty harsh.
Just gonna reach over and get
I guess it
bit.
depends kind of what your definition of that is.
Well, I guess for me it's so strange because I guess I'm kind of actually a good subject for this, and maybe for the people listening. I have those sort of filmic images of prisons being this kind of play. I hate things like Porridge, for example. You see that image of like a quiet, basically two old convicts basically sharing a prison cell, having a bit of a laugh with and it's that kind of thing where I'm sure there are certain prisons which aren't the best places in the world, like, heavily populated or, resources aren't great. But I also was thinking, maybe there's a prison in, I don't know, Cornwall that's like a little bit more nicer, you know what I mean, or less populated or whatever. So yeah, that's kind of what I meant by that. Is it sort of broad brushstrokes? Prisons are totally underserviced. They're all bad places for most criminals to be to go to in this country.
There are differences between prisons,
Okay.
but the levels of self-harm, the levels of violence, the levels of suicide, and the levels of death generally are shocking across the estate. So between 2016 2017, there were 300 deaths in prison. So it's 365 days in a year that 300 people died in prison last year.
Like, so, and how are those deaths related?
So I think, I haven't got this written down, I'm pretty sure it's about a third is suicides. There's been a big rise in kind of things that are classified as natural deaths, deaths from natural causes in the last few years. That's partly because we're seeing an increase in the age of the prison population, seeing many more older prisoners, due to kind of longer sentences and due to more convictions of sex offences, and the people who are convicted of that tend to be older. But also, like, the healthcare in prison is really, really appalling. So you'll have things like people dying from like diabetes. There was a teenager a few years ago died of an epileptic fit. People who have cancer will be waiting for months to see a doctor. It's very, very difficult to get access to healthcare in prison. The standards are not like in the community. So when we have all these deaths that are categorised as natural causes, but it's kind of, what does that mean? You know, how long would that person have lived if they had access to the healthcare that we have access, that you and me have access to? And that's across the prison estate. You know, it'll be better and worse in different places, but
God, that is pretty harrowing. For me, I learning this stuff, and like I say, I'm a total noob when it comes to prisons. I guess it's something which it's really, you know, hearing these sort of statistics read out to us. Why do you think this is not as sort of going off topic a little bit? Why is this not a conversation that's more on the forefront of people's minds? Why aren't, like, you know, people talking about this stuff, or why is it not in the mainstream media in the way that are prisons very much related to the politics that are happening in the system? You know, is it very intertwined? Like, why is this not being talked about?
I think there's a few reasons. Primarily, I think because this concept of the criminal as someone who is just kind of inherently bad and who deserves whatever's coming to them has been incredibly successful. So it's very difficult to kind of get people to give a shit about the well-being of people in prison. And then the other reason is because there's a concerted effort to keep it out of the media, and the Ministry of Justice are incredibly careful. They're incredibly risk-averse about what gets into the media. And when things do go into the media, they will jump in and try and control it with a narrative. You will have seen it in the news. So actually, we have had quite a lot of things about prisons in the news, and the headlines have been drugs, drones bringing drugs into prison.
Oh yeah, actually I remember that. Yeah.
And violence, gangs. It's not going to be poor healthcare. Sure. It's not going to be the levels of suicide.
There's that famous line in Shawshank Redemption where he says, what's his name? The protagonist in it, Andy Dufresne, is like campaigning to get a library, and he's like, look, the taxpayers, when they already don't like spending money on prisons, and even when they do, they want two things: they want more bars and more guards. Yeah. They certainly don't want a bloody library, or I guess in sort of this instance, better healthcare for prisoners.
So I mean, this week the Secretary of State for Justice announced a 30 million package for like security and safety in prisons, and that's mainly going on, I think, like body scanners, drug dogs, like
30 million. That doesn't sound like
cameras.
And that doesn't sound like a huge amount of money for all the prisons up and down the country.
No, it's not. It's really not. But that is kind of the narrative that the Ministry of Justice will go with every time, which perpetuates this undeserving prisoners thing, because what the image that gives you is just these like feral, violent people that we just need to contain at all costs. Yeah. And they're very successful at keeping the conversation at that level. So I think that's why we don't have these more in-depth conversations about what is actually going on in prisons, which is not really like drugs being delivered.
There was who was that? There was in one of your podcasts. It was quite interesting. There was, I can't remember it exactly, so you have to help me here. But it was something about, you quoted David Cameron saying, like, if you can't do the crime, if you don't do the time, don't do the crime, or something along those lines. And it seems like, after having this brief conversation, it seems like this is all very much this kind of cartoon approach to prisons and criminals, and this very much kind of like all tied with one brush. Like, you commit a crime, get into prison, and so you deserve everything that's coming to you because guess what, you committed a crime. And when I think about it, it's quite interesting, and I'm sure that many people out there, maybe even yourself, Oonagh, like when I think about my teenage years, and like, look, I was never like that of a bad kid, but there were times when I had scrapes with police, as naturally you would, when you're going out in town or you're messing around with a large group of lads or whatever, getting scraps and all this kind of stuff. There are I won't go into detail, but there maybe are some circumstances in my life where if one other decision might have been made, then I might have got put in the back of a police car or whatever. Whether or not I'd gone all the way to prison, I don't know. But it is funny when I kind of think about the idea of, if you like, the depersonalization of a criminal. When I think most people have no interaction with who a criminal is, or people who are involved in who are in prison, family members who are involved in the criminal justice system, and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's what's quite interesting to this whole argument is taking that is the media not necessarily putting a face to the criminals, a face to these kind of guys who are suffering in whatever way it is. And then it's easy enough to kind of like, what it sounds like, sweep everything in the blanket and be like, oh, they're criminals, this is what's going on, blah, blah, blah. We're going to get more money for police dogs and drug dogs because, that's what's happening in prisons these days. These criminals are doing X, Y, and Z. This all sounds like doom and gloom. And I'm just going to sort of play devil's advocate here. Like, is there any benefit to an individual going to prison? Like, if you're in the circumstance where you've been convicted of a crime and you go to prison, are there any upsides?
For what? For the person going in? Prison?
Yeah.
I mean, like broadly, no. Going to prison is awful. You can just try and imagine.
Oh yeah.
You're arrested, you're taken to court, you go to prison, and you can't even just like ring your family whenever you want. It's sometimes a little bit abstract to imagine this, but I think that's one of the most painful things for people is being cut off from their loved ones, regardless of the conditions within prison. Even if you're in a kind of like luxury hotel that was locked up, you might have kids.
Oh bloody hell! I mean, I work in this bedroom, like work from home in this room we're in now. I mean, Jesus. I mean, it's like, obviously I have the freedom to leave this house whenever I want, but if I'm basically spending most of it, I'm like, I start going insane just in this room with the internet.
And you can pick up the phone.
Or go down to the pub. Or whatever. Or do a podcast.
People in prison, a lot of people get a visit once a week. A lot of people don't get a visit once a week. A lot of people don't get any visits because of the circumstances of their lives, or because they've been moved to a prison that's hundreds of miles away and their family can't afford to get there. Phone calls are, so BT holds the contract for the prison phones. It's extremely expensive to call home. Average wage in prison is £9 a week. So
when you say average wage, which is in the money that
they get for working in the prison.
Oh really?
So everyone will have a job when they're in the prison. That's
interesting.
But obviously the wages are incredibly low and the cost for phone calls are incredibly high.
Sure. So just picking up on that, because that's something that I don't know anything about, but I presume when I said something like, okay, you hear stories of, guys, get their GCSEs or they get their trained to be an electrician or a chippy or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like, does that stuff exist? Does that happen?
There will be cases like that. It's quite rare, and it takes a lot of work from the individual involved. So like, to access education, to get qualifications, it's hard work. So if someone comes out of prison, they've got a qualification, I'm always really impressed, because it means they've like gone and they've bugged a load of people and they've really tried hard to like access that stuff.
So that's not readily available?
No.
It's not like you go to prison, it's like, right, okay, what's your stretch? Okay, a year. Right, well then you're going to do this course for a year. Or they choose, like, I almost think of it as kind of like, hi, here's a menu of courses you can do while you're here. You're basically locked up for a year, so yeah, you might as well do something or learn something.
So the more common situation will be like, you'll hear from like your mate on the wing that there might have been this course, and then you'll like spend weeks like asking around and asking guards and keep on bugging people, and eventually you'll like be able to fill in a form, and maybe you'll get referred. But also another problem that we have in the prison system is people are transferred between prisons all the time. So you might be halfway through a course, suddenly there's like an overcrowding situation, you get shipped off to the Isle of Wight, and then then you're on the waiting list again.
But I don't understand, and I'm trying to remove politics from this, I don't understand how that's not how is it so hard to basically provide... I mean, have you ever heard of lynda.com?
No.
So lynda.com it's an amazing resource, right? You pay £16 a month. It's a website, and it has like courses on if you want to learn how to podcast or sound engineering, there'll be a course that you just learn. I mean, it's literally like great videos. You do exams. It's whatever. It's £16 a month. Video editing. I taught myself Photoshop with it. I mean, it's an amazing thing. When I want to learn something, I go on lynda.com and pay £16. Basically, pretty much I'll do it in a month. And I learnt this thing. It's so simple. So when I'm hearing you saying like the prison system, it's so hot. A guy has to bug a guard to get a. I mean, this sounds insane. Like, why have we not got a system in place?
Yeah, I mean, it is ridiculous. And I'm not saying, like, there are prisons where those things are more accessible and, like, people do learn stuff.
Yeah.
But I guess, you know, it's that thing of these people don't deserve it.
Yeah. And
these people are dangerous. The money needs to go on security. And there is still this idea that people in prison are just like not worthy of having any of these things, so it's quite hard to sell it and also to get like prison officers behind it.
Sure.
So that's kind of why that stuff happens. Sure. But like you will meet people who will like say that them going to prison was a positive thing, which is obviously true if they're telling you that. And you will meet people who have committed crimes to get into prison because of the dire circumstances on the outside. And as I said before, that is really just an indictment of our society. Like, if your best option is to be in this place where people are committing suicide and dying and harming themselves every single day, or where you're at risk of like developing a drug addiction, or where you might be locked up in your cell 22 hours a day.
Yeah.
If that's your option, what does that say about the society that we've built outside?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to call some people out on the live stream. So all Dan one, basically everyone's trolling us, saying like, I can't hear any sound. Just let you know, guys out there, I've got my phone here streaming it, and I'm hearing pretty well the live stream that's coming from my phone and everything. So you can stop all your chatter about whether you can hear it or not. So going back to the topic at hand, this is. So this is all, I mean, like I said, this is so eye-opening for me because, like I said, I don't know much about it, and I'm sure many people out there don't know much about it because essentially our only access to learning about prisons is through mainstream media, which obviously is awful. So in terms of going sort of like back to the start of this topic, this guy just said, I just noticed my speakers were turned off. Is this debate fairly modern? Like, is this something which is just coming to the forefront? Prison reformation, prison abolition. Like, obviously, I've been, you know, I've known you for a year or so, and Sam has been talking about this for the last year. How is this conversation being, like, is it expanding, or is it when did it start, basically?
Well, the prison reform debate has been about for as long as prisons existed.
Right.
In a way, prisons kind of came out of prison reform. Weirdly enough, it was like reforming these like local jails and being like, we're going to have a nice, efficient like state prison system. But the abolition movement, I mean, as well, has kind of been around for as long as that, but is really kind of, the modern abolition movement really comes from the States. So that was started in mainly kind of black communities or communities of colour in the States, where it was clear to them that they weren't able to rely on the justice system. So while like you or me might consider calling the police,
as in being white,
if something's hot, if you've been like robbed, or if you've been a victim of assault, communities of colour knew they kind of didn't have that option because the police were not there to protect them, and getting in touch with the police would just put them at risk of more violence. So they were kind of forced into this situation of like having to just come up with other strategies to keep themselves safe and to deal with harm that was happening either to their communities or within their communities. And so actually like a lot of where I get my ideas from and thoughts and like why I'm an abolitionist is because of the work of mainly black women in the US who have kind of set up community projects
Sure.
to address harm.
Could you give any examples of? I mean, because when you start talking about like sort of the systems which people put in place, immediately I was just thinking of Black Panthers, for example. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I just know them kind of like helping their own community in terms of deterring or basically being something that would replace the police because the police wouldn't help them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right, or is that inaccurate?
I mean, I'd certainly see the Black Panthers as abolitionist projects. Like
really. When you say abolition project, just so I'm clear on the terminology, abolitionist project specifically referring to prison systems.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's lots of work that isn't explicitly abolitionist that would very much fall into the abolition project, because the idea is that you're building a society that is caring, that prevents harm, and that doesn't rely on these punitive systems. So things the Black Panthers were doing around like providing breakfast for school kids, kind of building community movements, doing these like community education projects, all of that stuff is really, really important. So yeah, I certainly see that as like an abolitionist project.
I didn't even know that about the Black Panther. That is I mean, it sounds so basic, doesn't it? Like, and I actually just on that point there, I'm sure we'll move on to this later on, but essentially what I'm getting, and correct me if this is not right, but the whole point of the prison system is basically saying like, we don't need to have a prison because basically it's like, it's not even a last resort. It's like, let's fix the problems in the society before an individual even gets into this sort of like, why do we even need to get to this point, basically? Is that the sort of the general ethos behind the abolition movement?
Yeah, I think probably the key point is that harm doesn't have... So we need to distinguish firstly between crime and harm.
Yeah.
Crime and harm are not necessarily the same things. There are lots of things that are criminalised that are not harmful.
Right.
For example, being homeless. You're not harming anyone by being homeless.
Right.
Yet there are many aspects of being homeless that are criminalised.
Yeah.
Similarly, there are lots of things that are very harmful that are not criminalised. So corporate crime, or like the levels of air pollution that we have. So there are like thousands of people dying in this country from air pollution. There is nothing... I mean, there are laws about it. There's no criminal action happening to hold those people to account.
Do not get me started on, I mean, for me, well, I don't want to get into it now, but the fact that corporations get away literally with murder, and like we just don't. For me, it's absolutely insane, and so this is really interesting. So, anyway, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because
it is that thing of like people can go to prison for shoplifting. You literally see mothers go to prison for shoplifting nappies. And baby formula, and still no one has been held to account for Grenfell, for
bank arrest in 2008.
Yeah.
I mean that is what's really insane. In the whole, I can only talk from the US statistics, but I think it was 8 people didn't even go to prison but were charged after the sort of the banking crisis for the levels of embezzlement and sort of misconduct within giant corporations.
I mean, similarly, 1,000 people have died in police custody since the 1990s. There have been, I think, 5 prosecutions, all of which ended in acquittal of the officers that were responsible for those deaths.
Sure.
And what that leads us to ask really is kind of what is criminalised and why are certain people labelled as criminals, and how is that useful for the current system and the current hierarchy of power that we have.
So taking it back to the question which started this was so this is prison reform has been happening or the debate has been happening since prisons have been around. Bring it back to sort of like our society, our media, and the way that sort of I guess our peer groups talk about it. Is the conversation being heard more or being heard less?
I mean, I think in this country we're still at kind of an early stage with an abolition movement.
Who's on the forefront, countries-wise?
The US.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Like
really?
That's where so much of this politics comes from.
Are you being serious? I thought that would have been like, they would be like, no, this is like, we love the prison system because, well, the government would be saying we love the prison system because of, I mean, the Louis Theroux obviously done a lot of work on this. I've watched a few documentaries on it. Like, the prison economy in the US is insane. Like, the fact that they have these privatized prisons just for the prison guards to like whole communities are existing and being sort of their local economy of employment is because of a prison. Like it's I'm really shocked by that.
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of makes sense that the resistance would be stronger or like more well developed in a country with that kind of history. And a lot of it does come from like the Black Panthers or the Black radical movements of the 60s and the 70s. So that's kind of why it's strongest there. And I guess in this country, I think we're still a long way off kind of like really having that conversation on a grand scale. And we're still not talking about that kind of key component of what abolitionism is talking about, and that is the fact that harm is not located within bad individuals. So bad things don't happen because we just have these people who are monsters.
Right.
We have to actually look at the structures in society, the systems, the cultures that are allowing these things to happen.
I have to say it's interesting. I think it sort of as I get older, I'm sort of going sort of the opposite way of how when people get older they get more conservative. I'm getting more liberal. I mean, it's so interesting because I, in my younger years, would always look at the individual and go, they've done this thing because they themselves are responsible for the decisions they make, so on and so forth, which has part truth to it. But basically, we all are the people we are because the environment we grow up in, the relationship with our parents, whatever, so on and so forth. It's why now I've changed so dramatically in saying like, well, look, someone can commit a crime, 100%, and they've made that decision to do so. But the factors going into that, if you go way back to the genesis of the societal things surrounding them that had that, the environment they grow up, their education, their relationship with their parents, maybe they've, whatever reason, that's the kind of core responsibility. That's the kind of core reasons why they've done what they have done. But I guess we're kind of not encouraged to think like that, really. With sort of mainstream media, because you could always say, well, stop making excuses for the individual. Like they do the crime, pay for it. Like what, I guess that kind of leads us on to the next sort of point I want to talk about, which is if an individual. I mean, okay, so with talking about sort of like if you do the crime, you do the time. Why? I guess it's kind of the overarching bigger question. What is the alternative then? Like what? So I understand what you're saying. It's essentially like we shouldn't even have prisons in the first place because our society should be in such a healthy state that we don't even need to have penal measures for an individual who commits a crime. Or if they are, it's certainly not locking them in a prison cell for 22 hours a day. What? Okay, I'm going to break this down to two questions. What are the alternatives in an ideal situation? Like, click your fingers. What is the kind of like utopia of the justice system? Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to just take a step back just to address something that you introduced that with, which is really relevant. So this idea of like individual responsibility versus kind of like leeway for the society and the culture and the structure that you've lived in. And I think that's a really, really key difference between the reform movement and the abolition movement.
Okay. And would you mind just kind of expanding on those 2 points? Because we talked a lot about abolition, but reform, and in researching this, I know that they're two quite big topics.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the two things are necessarily in conflict. We're obviously not going to abolish prisons tomorrow, so we're going to have to be reformist steps along the way. But those reforms need to be looking towards a horizon of abolition. So prison reform, I think, is a kind of position of we reform prisons, we make the system humane. We still have prisons, but we make them good.
So, for example, they'd have you go in there, you have courses, maybe psychotherapy, you would have drug rehabilitation in there, so on and so forth. That's sort of reform over here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the abolitionist position on that is kind of that actually that's the ridiculous utopian position. We've been doing prison reform for hundreds of years. And we haven't gone anywhere. It is still painful, it's still violent, it's still harmful, it still doesn't prevent harm. And it still doesn't provide what those people need. So the abolitionist position is like, let's maybe start somewhere else, because actually the system was never meant to do anything good. And
I love that. I'm a big fan of that, just across everything. It's like, we need to start again. This is mental.
Yeah.
Like, this is insane. Like, for example, my opinions of the House, the political system as a whole, or voting system. I know you and I, Sam, have talked about this before, but it's like, oh, could we just start again?
Yeah.
Like, this is insane. Like, this is actually insane.
It's ridiculous.
How the hell do we have the House of Lords still? I mean, just get rid of it. Like, we're not reforming it. Like, no. Let's start again. So I'm totally in that camp when it comes to, like, radicalisation, going like, yeah, come on, let's just, get rid of it, full stop.
Yeah, I think, and that's essentially, it's just like, it's not worked. It's
Yeah.
a horrible system.
Yeah.
It was set up for horrible reasons.
Yeah.
So, like, let's start from somewhere else. And I think another really, really key difference is this thing about responsibility. So I think there's a bit of a tendency within the reform movement because essentially, like, prisons are still seen as, like, functional and useful. There's a bit of a tendency to say, oh, that person served their time.
Right.
Or, like, they're just a victim of their circumstance.
Yes.
And now let's move on. And I think the prison reform movement doesn't deal very well with the question about, like, what about the victims?
Right.
And on one hand, we need to break down this binary between, like, victim perpetrator anyway, because almost everyone in prison has previously been a victim of some kind of awful harm. On the other hand, though, we do actually need to say, like, yeah, people are responsible for their actions. We need to find a way for people to be accountable for the way they harm others.
Totally.
And to make amends and to change themselves when they have actually harmed someone. I
Totally.
think that is right at the heart of abolition.
Got it.
And that's why the prison reform movement, I think, is, like, so unsatisfactory for me, because it has no answers about, like, how do we actually help people to come forward and say, oh, I did this thing, it was really harmful, and this is what I'm going to do to change how I'm acting.
So this is really interesting, and I really want to sort of dig into this, because I think kind of anyone from the outsider's point of view that maybe doesn't share or align with the sort of same politics yourself, Oonagh, would, we haven't talked about it yet, but the victims of the crime, okay? So I'll sort of take on the persona of an individual who, let's say, doesn't agree with the way you are discussing prisons, and say, for example, this individual caused horrendous harm to my family, fill in the gaps however you want. I want to see them put in a prison cell, locked up, take away all their freedoms, all their liberties, don't give them a phone, don't give them anything, whatever the case may be, because that's the pain that's being caused to me. So how relevant is this debate, or if I guess how appropriate is this debate to that individual who's feeling like that? Can you argue with someone with those kind of mentalities based on the personal harm that they've had on them?
I mean, I firstly, like, I wouldn't want to come from a point of arguing. I think a key problem we have in society is a lack of support for victims. I don't mean of crime, but of any harm, of abuse,
Sure.
Of violence, and that's a big reason why there's so many people in the prison system. Most of those people have been through, like, extreme amounts of trauma, extreme amounts of abuse, and there was no support for them.
Sure.
And I think often people have punitive urges because we don't have the support we need in place.
Sure.
And I don't think it should be that person's job, the person who's been harmed, to have to deal with what happens to this person. Obviously, like, they should have a say, of course. But what often happens when we individualize these situations is we don't look at the social context of something. So particularly with sexual violence, when we look at instances of rape and sexual violence, we individualize it right down to this, like, situation between two people. One of them's evil, one of them is a helpless victim. We don't look at all at the social context around. And what that does is it puts a huge amount of pressure on that person who's been harmed to deal with that situation and to kind of problem solve, basically.
Right.
And I don't think it should be their responsibility. I think we need to, as a community, say, like, what are we going to do to make sure that this person feels safe, to make sure they've got everything they need to heal from this, and to make sure that this other person who has perpetrated this harm is not going to harm anyone else, and to address this, how we let this happen.
Systemic problems.
Yeah,
around
how
the
as
whole
a
thing.
society have we let this situation happen?
So let me sort of play devil's advocate here. Is what you're talking about, and this word's kind of used quite a lot, but are you sort of saying that this exists within a utopia where it's like well, if things like this do happen, then we have the resources and we also have the inclination from our government, from our general society, from our individual relationships in order to remedy these things. So I guess the question is, will that ever be achievable?
I mean, I think so. The end goal for me is this kind of huge grand project of caring where we have the resources and the knowledge and the strength as communities to actually look at these situations in the context that they're in. So rather than just having this blanket one size fits all approach to harm of just you've done something, okay, we're going to lock you up. It needs to be what has actually gone on here, and what are the details. And I know that sounds overwhelming for people. I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous on the scale of it, but I think it's possible. We have huge projects of changing society. So something that I talk about a lot is that the left will have these big conversations about changing society, massive programs of nationalization, things like universal basic income.
Big fan. Huge
transformations, right? But the moment you start saying, well, how about if everyone was trained in trauma support? Or how about if we all had the time to really sit around as a big group of people and unpick these situations of harm and come up with a tailor-made remedy for all these things that happen? People are well, that's absolutely ridiculous. And I'm well, we've got all these other grand projects. Why can't we think about that in that way?
And that's really interesting, and sort of tapping into things like UBI, which are very practical, because I think anyone listening to this would almost go oh, you're living in a dream world of, everyone's sort of looking out for one another, and society is this kind of, there's only a tiny percentage of people that decide to commit crime in the first place, so on and so forth. I guess, would there be any argument to say that... I'll take it back. Are you talking about this? Do you think this is achievable within your lifetime, for example, or do you think this is something which is way bigger than even this debate? We're not talking about necessarily prison reform here. We're talking about societal, top-down, total abolition of current systems, of mentalities, the media, corporate structure, capitalism, blah 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 blah. I'm almost thinking maybe even prison systems is just a small slice of a giant cake that you're sort of tapping into here. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think, do we need to talk about abolitionism? I think it's anti-capitalism, really. That's the grand project,
Sure.
is dismantling racial capitalism. But in terms of whether it's going to be done in my lifetime, there are steps that are happening, and I think it's important to remember that actually lots of people are living abolition already. So, for example, the super rich live abolition, right? They don't have the police hanging out.
Expand on that, because that's really interesting. So, super rich exist within abolition.
The police aren't hanging out in their neighbourhoods.
Yeah.
The state is not intervening in their lives. They don't tend to call the police on each other. You don't see the super rich going to prison.
That's really interesting.
They don't live with a law system. They don't live with the same system that applies to you.
But someone would say, someone who doesn't share your viewpoint would go, well, yeah, they're not committing crime. Why would they need the police?
They absolutely are. There is just so much evidence they are committing huge tax fraud, tax avoidance. I mean, we know that sexual violence goes on at every tier of society. There's so much evidence of the huge amounts of crime, on grand scales, way beyond what even you or I could even do if we wanted to. They have the resources to commit levels of crime that are just unimaginable for us.
So why are they living in an abolition with abolition and most of society aren't?
Because the system was set up to criminalise poor people and to criminalise people of colour.
Right.
So they're not in those categories. They're not. They can't be conceived of as the criminals.
Yeah.
So that's important to remember. And also there are lots of ways in which we do abolitionist things. So most people, the kids are acting up, right? You don't call the cops. There's plenty of situations where harm occurs and we don't call the cops.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's even kind of worth saying that most people who commit crime obviously don't go to prison.
Yeah.
Particularly with rape and sexual violence, most rapists will never come into contact with the criminal justice system. I'm not saying that's a good thing.
Wait. Most rapists don't come into contact with the criminal justice system.
Vast majority is. It's an endemic problem.
Okay, maybe this is a topic for another video. What just in a nutshell, what do you mean they don't come in contact with the criminal justice system?
Sexual violence is endemic in our society,
right.
And many people, the majority of people who are victims of that act, don't go to the police either because they don't think they will be believed.
Right, I see. Right.
And, you know, or they actually don't want that person to be arrested because, you know, they obviously want the violence to stop, but they don't want to see that person go to prison. Sexual violence obviously is usually committed by someone close to the victim.
Yeah, sure.
It might be the father of your children. You don't necessarily want to see that person go to prison. So there's lots and lots of reasons.
Sure.
You know, generally the patriarchy.
Sure. When I heard you say that, I was almost thinking that it was like people were getting caught of these crimes and the law wasn't as strict on sexual violences or whatever.
I mean, there's a huge attrition rate. So we talk about like there's this statistic, but yeah, I don't know. It's a longer conversation.
Absolutely. I feel like you might be going...
in terms of the police taking those things seriously and taking them to court, there are huge problems specifically within the field of sexual violence.
Sure.
But it's just to note that, like, actually, you know, you don't always go to prison if you commit crime,
No.
and we don't always rely on the criminal justice system to deal with our problems. And so we kind of have the resources. We've got like the seeds of the resources there to deal with this stuff.
Sure. So I guess sort of going way back to the start of this. So I said in an ideal environment, like Oonagh's prime minister or whatever you want to call it. How would the lack of prisons or prisons not existing, what would that look like? What would that landscape look like? The penal system or the justice system, however you want to call it, how would it look like in your ideal, like the perfect scenario? What would it look like?
So at kind of base level, like everyone would be housed, everyone would have enough resources to be alive and to thrive. We would have very thorough mental health and trauma services, and when people did experience harm, they would have access to very specialised support.
When you've mentioned trauma a few times, and I've not picked up on it, but it's piqued my interest. What do you mean by people who are trained to deal with trauma? What do you mean by trauma, and what do you mean how to deal with it?
So trauma, I mean, I'm not a specialist in trauma, but it's a huge issue for people in the criminal justice system. So, like, often when someone has committed a kind of violent act, if we take like stabbing for something topical, you'll often find that person has been a victim of violence before, and the effects of that can be really, really life-changing. And it varies a lot from person to person. But you can find that trauma will make someone very, very fearful and kind of jumpy and anxious all the time.
Totally.
And one possible response to that is to act out violently as a kind of preemptive protecting yourself situation.
Or even, I guess, if I'm assuming right, turn to other antisocial behaviours like, I don't know, violence or drugs or whatever it may be, in response to not having dealt with that trauma. Yeah,
so I mean, we had Whitney Isles on the podcast a little while ago, and she runs a kind of a trauma-informed charity that addresses, a social enterprise called Project 507, and it prevents and addresses serious youth violence.
I think I listened to that one. That was quite interesting. She her perspective on things was like the way that I only sort of tapped the first half of it, but for example, the way that the media are portraying gangs was that the right one we're talking about? And she was actually saying like, well, look, where were the individuals to see, if these individuals were being looked after on their way home from school or so on and so forth and that kind of stuff. And so she talks about how people react to trauma in a lot of different ways, and one of the things she brought up was actually a common response to trauma will be overworking yourself. That might be a more kind of like functional pro-social behaviour that we think of as quite normal, but that can be often a response to trauma, or like drug use, alcohol use, sometimes violence. Overworking. So So an individual, this is interesting. So an individual in response to dealing with trauma in their life would overwork. Are we talking about sort of like people with like office jobs and stuff?
Yeah. It's not.
So they'd rather than address the emotional situations that might be happening at home, they'd be like, right, I'm going to work 18 hours a day, go home, sleep, wake up, go back to work.
Yeah. So the point is that we see a spectrum of responses, and sometimes those responses can be harmful.
Sure.
And what you need really is someone to kind of that understands how people respond to that. And we need more of us to understand that stuff. So
that's the part of the utopia, trauma, understanding and dealing with trauma. So an individual can recognise trauma that's happened in their life and then seek out the necessary training or way of dealing with it and coping with it.
I mean, an example that I use a lot is there was a stabbing, I think, a couple of years ago, and it was a 15-year-old boy killed another 15-year-old boy. And this 15-year-old was kind of like, he was in the media, he was called evil, a killer. And actually, Gary Young from The Guardian did this piece where he kind of interviewed the boy's mother. And if you look at this boy's life history, in primary school, his father was deported. His mum then tried to get him into the mental health services. Our mental health services for children in particular are so underfunded that you basically have to be suicidal before they'll let you in. So he couldn't get mental health support. He was then excluded from secondary school. He was moved around from pupil referral unit to pupil referral unit. His mum was desperately trying to get him the right education. She eventually went to social services. She went to the police. She went to everyone she could find to say, I'm so worried about my son. He's going to die or he's going to kill someone. Please, will you do something? No one did anything. There was no support. And eventually he killed someone. And then we say he's a monster. So I guess the utopia would be the opposite of that.
Sure,
It would be like that kid would have the support he needed.
As soon as they recognise an issue.
Yeah. I mean, his father never would have been deported, obviously, in the utopia. But if he experienced mental health problems, there would be people there for him straight away.
The interesting thing is I agree with most of the things you've been saying the whole time. And for the sake of argument, I've been trying to place my opinions of an individual that wouldn't share the same necessary politics as you or I, or align with us in the stuff that we've been talking about. And it's kind of funny because when you explain things like that, I mean, I'm trying would there be anyone in the country that would disagree with this kind of utopia? It's kind of strange, but I think we're always talking about it in terms of these individuals who don't necessarily even the liberal values that we were discussing quite easily. Actually, would they ever get round to it? Do you know what I'm trying to get at here? It's interesting. It's almost like kind of saying, like, if you presented this argument to most people, hard right conservatives, would they even still have a problem with this utopia that you're describing?
Well, I mean, often in studies of kind of the general public and their levels of punitiveness, it'll be found that once people are kind of given the details of those specific situations, they tend to be a lot less punitive than actually our law system is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess for me, it's about asking people what kind of society they want to live in, and then we figure out how we get there. And normally the evidence demonstrates that imprisonment and punishment is not the way that you get.
Well, this is really interesting. So this brings us back to sort of the topic, is it time to get rid of prisons? In your utopia that we did, which I'm sure will be a lot of people's utopia, it sounds great. We, that is quite, click your fingers kind of scenario. Taking it back to the more realistic. Now, if we're talking about like 2018, England, yourself, what are the necessary practical steps that we get towards achieving, not necessarily that utopia, but getting towards that answer of let's get rid of prisons?
Yeah. So most of them are outside the justice system.
Okay.
A lot of them are in the current Labour Party manifesto.
Oh, really?
Things like more council housing.
So yeah, you keep going back to housing. That's almost like the primary thing you keep going to is housing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that it's very contextual, and it's like right now there's a huge housing crisis.
Sure.
It's one of the biggest things funneling people into the criminal justice system, and it's one of the biggest things that's making it very, very difficult for people to get out of the criminal justice system. And it's a human right. Like, we just should have a society where everyone has decent housing to live in. And it's like, doesn't feel incredibly utopian. It doesn't feel like that difficult to say.
Unachievable.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, and it's also like it's hard to argue with.
Yeah, like I said, I'm trying to think. I mean, The only argument I keep thinking of when we sort of talk about even the more practical sense of it from a conservative point of view is someone just going like, well, how much is this going to cost? You know, well, okay, how are we going to afford all these houses that people are going to buy, you know, that live in? If we're going to house the whole of society, you know, I'm not trust, you know, the conservative argument would be, well, who's going to pay for all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an economist. You can ask John McDonnell about that, I'm
Okay.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. He'd have the right answer.
Sure, absolutely. So housing's the first one, and like I say, most of the answers to this practical, the way of getting rid of prisons is, okay, so we start off with housing, and then we reform society. What are the kind of key areas in which we need to reform our society?
So I mean, there's practical things like the education system.
Right.
We need to make it harder for schools to be excluding children. That's a key kind of step on the way from like what some people call the school to prison pipeline.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
There's a massive correlation between children being excluded from school,
right,
and then ending up in the criminal justice system.
That's interesting, because even talking to Sam, our friend, he was saying that a lot of the guys that he's worked with in prison have a reading age of 10 to 11-year-olds or something like that. I don't know if I'm right with that statistic, but I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, they it's like they can only read like they're like 9 or 10 years old. Yeah.
I mean, and it's a big problem with our education system in the way that like certain children get treated, the lack of support that they have, the difficulty that our system has with like dealing with mental health issues or learning difficulties, and the way that, I mean, our system is still very punitive. You know, I'm sure you remember from school, like if you act out, what's likely to happen is you are punished.
Yes.
Probably, like what's unlikely is that someone's going to take you aside and say, what's going on at home? Can I help you?
Sure.
Do you need counselling? Can we support you with this thing? That doesn't happen in many schools, and particularly in schools that are underfunded. But
that's quite interesting to tap into when you sort of break it down in terms of just make it relatable for myself. Yeah, when I was at school, if I misbehaved, I got a punishment like, you know, writing lines or detention or suspension. I never got suspended, very close. But that to me, for me, was a deterrent. I mean, a massive deterrent. Like, I didn't want to get those things, and so I didn't do them, or I made sure that I didn't get caught doing the things which I was going to do. Would you be implying that the same principle you could even apply to in the education system with kids? Like saying, like, okay, we don't need to punish kids. What we need to do is we need to say, like, right, why is this individual acting out, so on and so forth. Is that still the same principle we're applying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it depends on the individual. So for you, that might have been a deterrent. For someone who is perhaps experiencing neglect or abuse at home, or has had something happen to them, like a parent being deported, that deterrent might not be the same thing. Sure. They may not be in control of their behaviour in the same way. So it's kind of, it's difficult to say that you should apply that same thing to like every single kid. Yeah,
it's funny. I'm sure there's people who might be listening to this who'd literally be like, oh, you know, if a kid misbehaves, come on, just like give them a clip around the ear. They'll never do it. They'll never do it again. But I guess it's less about. I mean, if I'm listening to you correctly, it's actually has nothing to do with this system. It's all about the individual at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between setting boundaries and punishing as well. You know, I'm not saying like let all the kids do whatever they want all the time. But I mean, like I've worked a little bit in the education system as well, and like that's probably my hatred for school and how much I hated that as a young person. I'm sure it had something to do with how obsessed I am with.
You hated the education system when you were a little.
Yeah, I hated being at school. I hated it.
What did you act out?
Like not in a massive way, a little bit, but like, you know, I think just something about the kind of the level of punitiveness and the fact that like no one, like half my teachers didn't really know my name, no one knew anything about my life, and just that you would see like no one would ever kind of have a conversation with you.
Sure.
And having worked in primary school since, it's very, very difficult to sit down with a kid and be like, oh, can you not hit this other kid because it's hurtful for them.
Yeah.
What the response that you would get often is like, well, you're going to give me a sticker, you're going to give me detention. It's very, very instrumental, and that's kind of like, I don't think that's a natural thing for children. I think that's what we like socialize them into.
Yeah.
And I think we need to get to a point of like building relationships and communities where people feel like they don't want to hurt other people, and that might be children, that might be adults.
Yeah.
Because they're actually like invested in the situation.
while we're on the subject of kind of like the education system and I guess sort of all these practical steps to reach the replacement of prisons, one of the statistics talking about the other thing as well was the family unit as well. I don't know about your background, Oonagh, but certainly mine, like, you know, I grew up in a very stable household. So I'm imagining with housing, with education, is that another huge factor that comes along with I guess the reasons why an individual might go into a criminal route and end up in the prison system?
Yeah, I mean, there's massive levels of abuse or neglect. So, like, many people in the prison system will have either experienced or witnessed domestic violence as a child. But, like, even aside from that, just growing up in levels of poverty that are very, very difficult for even kind of the most well-meaning parent to mitigate. So if a parent's having to work all the time just to put food on the table, it's going to be a real struggle to give the support that you want to give to your kids. So, yeah, issues at home are a big deal, but I would be very, very wary of kind of like locating them in the family as if there's kind of these like deficient families. And that's, you know, often what we get from the right is this kind of like feckless single mother image of just like the single mother that's got loads of babies and she's on benefits and she doesn't give a shit, she's not raising her children properly. Sure. That's not the reality. And so I get a little bit wary when we start talking about kind of like problems in the family. Okay. Again, I think we need to contextualize them within the kind of like society that we live in. Yeah. But yeah, that's a big factor. Sure. Another big thing is the care system. So the number of children going into care, and then the way in which our care system operates, meaning that it's very, very easy for those children to be criminalised. So a pattern is that care workers who are not paid enough will often call the police for like minor things that happen within the home that a child that's in their family home would never be criminalised for. Right. And that's particularly happened since the contracting out of care homes, privatisation of the care system. Happens a lot more in private care homes where you see more agency staff who are on lower pay. So again, that's like that's a step that we can take outside the criminal justice system that would have a massive knock-on effect on how many kids are going into the justice system. Once again, I'm trying to argue with taking my head off and putting on a right-wing agenda on my head. So I guess the right-wing establishment would say something along the lines of, well, look, Oonagh, if we did have these kind of systems in place which were idyllic, and we had huge resources pumped into social services, into housing, into child welfare, into education system, yada, 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 you might encourage a sector of society to not then take responsibility for themselves, or try and, I guess, within this sort of capitalist structure, go out and achieve as an individual. They'll be like, oh, the state's going to take care of me. Great, I can do X, Y, and Z. Is that fair to say? Is that, or does the evidence not point to that at all? The evidence doesn't point to that. I think the responsibility thing, particularly when we look at justice, is a key part of... So actually, like, one of my biggest problems with prison is that when someone has committed harm, prison is incredibly ineffective at helping that person to face up to what they've done, to admit it, to take responsibility, and to then change their behaviour. Mm-hmm. And that's because prison is an extremely traumatic thing to experience. So what it kind of does is make them into a victim. You're in this turmoil, you're suddenly taken away from your family, you're put in this horrible situation. Often what you find is that, at least at first, people are very wrapped up in their own situation because their own situation is horrific regardless of what they've done. So it can be, not always, I think there's also a lot of guilt and shame in prison around what people have done, but it can be extremely difficult for someone to kind of get outside their immediate circumstances and to reflect on the harm they've caused. Sure. And I think that thing about responsibility is really, really important, and we need to be able to build a society that actually like supports people as terrorists, but like gives people incentives to actually come forward and say like, yeah, I've done this thing and I want to take responsibility for my behaviour with support.
This is I think this is great. We're sort of coming sort of full circle back to the issue. I think we'll start to wrap. Guess how long we're talking for, Oonagh? I'll hide the time. Guess how long?
I don't know.
Guess.
Like an hour, maybe? Is it an
hour and a half.
Oh my god.
It's insane, isn't it?
This is why my podcasts are so long.
Well, it's
Because
great.
I just go on and on.
No. I mean, I could go on for another 2 hours. I mean, I absolutely love it. Coming full circle, because I think maybe people listening, this is, I'm trying
Thanks for sticking with us, guys.
Oh yeah. Well, like I say, it's more the podcast afterwards, but we've got 7 people with us at the moment, so
it's impressive.
You can see our little views here. There's 2 things I want to tap into, sort of like round off the discussion, and get your thoughts on Oonagh, because it's really interesting to sort of make sure we cover this, and we've spoken about it a little bit over the debate. The whole idea of replacing prisons. So, is it time to get rid of prisons, which is what we're talking about? And if the answer to that is yes, it's time to get rid of them, which I assume that's the side of the argument you're on, is how do we then punish an individual? Like, so let's say we're living in utopia, we're living in Oonagh's, everything's great, but you still get a man or a woman who for some reason decides to cause harm to another individual. Let's just, I don't know, he or she stabs someone because they stole their car or whatever, I don't know, some whatever. How do we then punish an individual if we don't have a prison system?
Well, I guess the question is, do we want to punish them?
Sure.
And is that effective? So the abolitionist question in that situation would be, how do we prevent this person from causing harm again?
Yeah, and I get that.
And punishment has been proved to be like incredibly ineffective actually at doing that. And I don't mean like.
So can we tap into this, because this is, I think, is interesting. Punishment itself. We're not talking about prisons here. We're talking about punishment. Mm-hmm. So an individual's done something bad. You punish them. That has been proven to be extremely ineffective. Is that right?
Yeah. In actually like preventing
it happening again.
Further harm. Yeah.
So this is interesting. Okay, and it could be indirect, because all I'm thinking about is making it personal. But when I did something wrong as a kid, I got clipped round the ear, and guess what? I never did it. I never did it again. Like, as a young lad, and I don't hold any resentment for my parents for that. So I'm trying to, because I don't want to, I totally agree with everything in the prison system side of things. But when we talk about punishment as a broad spectrum, I guess it's kind of, this is what I'm getting into, and I just want to get you to expand on that a little bit more.
I mean, I don't want to challenge like your own idea of your childhood that you've experienced.
Sure.
But I guess my question.
But please do if you want to.
My question about that
I'll be
is
offended.
Like, what else were you experiencing alongside that you were?
Probably just being a little shit. And like.
But were you experiencing a loving family?
Yeah.
A stable home, people who respected you, people who knew about you, people who understood you.
Yeah.
And I would suggest
I did something wrong.
I'd suggest that like maybe that stuff has more to do with it than just the punishment, and that what your family might have been doing there is like maybe it's more towards a punitive side, but they're setting boundaries, and they're kind of like using that clip around the ear was less a kind of like you're a bad person. It's more like I'm letting you know where the limit is here.
Sure.
And you had a relationship with those people.
Sure.
And you have like an investment in wanting to keep that relationship, and you're receiving like a lot of positive things.
Sure.
That's quite different to a situation where we say, you've done this thing, you're an evil person, okay, that's it, you're excluded from society now. So what you were experiencing there was like maybe a level of punishment, but like a form of inclusion at the same time, and that kind of action from your family, as well as letting you know that you're doing something wrong, let you know that you're part of the family.
Totally. That's interesting. So going back to the original question, is saying what are the alternatives? So you're halfway through. What are the alternatives then? So ideal scenario, ideal world that we're living in, utopia. Our utopia, so on and so forth. An individual still does something that is wrong. The alternative is not necessarily punishment, full stop kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the next step, so let's say a stabbing has occurred, the first step is the support for the victim of that situation. And speaking to them and like ascertaining what they need from that situation in order to then make them feel safe and to feel like they can heal from what's happened.
Sure.
And the next step is like figuring out why that person did that thing. And
then just going back to that point, so how we live today is essentially, the response to that is, well, we're going to lock the person up who did that thing, so they can't do it again to you or your family or anyone else.
So our response might be like, this person needs to be kept away in this immediate moment, especially from the victim. I don't think that necessarily needs to be a prison. Like, I think there are lots of different ways of keeping people safe. Like, it's very, very rare that like someone is just like blanket violent to everyone around them. And then the next step, it's like figuring out what has happened in this situation and finding ways for like that person who's done that thing to understand why they did it. To like admit that they did it, confront that, and then change the behaviour. And like, there's a lot of detail in there.
And I'm sure we could go, and I think that's really interesting, because I think that's a really good sort of like final topic, sort of just, go into a little bit. So you've mentioned this a few times throughout the podcast. The individual has to recognise what they've done. That is the key objective, really, when they get after the sort of the altercation or whatever. Is there any systems or is there any sort of theories into how that might look today? Like, what would that look like? Someone taking responsibility, how, coming to terms with the crime that they've committed. How would that be approached? Because anyone listening to this is like going like, oh, come off it, just put them in prison. Like,
and it's difficult. Like, there's a big question. You will, particularly in today's society, you get people who just won't admit they've done harm, won't confront it. And I'd say first that the prison system doesn't deal with that problem. Right. So like, the prison system actually isn't a way to solve that problem, because it's not solving that problem. So we do need to start again. I don't have all the answers, but like, nor does the prison system. But there are examples of projects. There's an organisation called Circles UK, which supports men who have committed sex offences when they come out of prison. And the idea is that they build a kind of like they have a circle of volunteers, and it's several people. They meet with the person once a week, and this person can go to them to kind of discuss any issues like they're having. And it might just be like, I'm struggling to get a job, but it might literally be like, I'm thinking about offending. And the idea is that you have a community around you to support you, but also to hold you accountable, and that they're sitting there saying like, I know what you did. It's harmful. It's important that you don't do it again, and I'm here to support you. But I also care that you don't do this thing again. And that really like relies on that individual taking accountability. But they have the support to be able to take accountability for that.
Before we went live, I'll sort of end this with, it's interesting. We were talking about a little bit like what we're going to discuss. And I'm just trying to wear the head of the mentality of someone reading this title of this podcast and going like, oh my God, this is such a hippy-dippy kind of thing. What you're talking about, like getting rid of prisons is just, prisons is unnecessary punishment for our society. And they might have heard arguments that you've been made. But is it fair to say that we will ultimately always need prison for some individuals that exist in our society based on how harmful they are to society, whatever, add in whatever you want here, like psychopathic killer, whatever. Do we still need a system whereby that individual can be locked up and the key thrown away?
No.
Right.
No, and again, it's going into a broader thing of what our idea of like human nature is, which I think it's also come very much from capitalism.
And I think that's really interesting, because I've been thinking about that a lot the whole way through. It's like going, prison almost seems as a kind of humanistic response, like punishment seems as a response to an individual who's done something wrong, and therefore emotionally you kind of need that kind of sense of revenge. You need that sense of like, right, and the same way that sort of like, you know, chimpanzee tribes would like beat down another chimpanzee, you know, for doing something wrong, to create that status and that hierarchy, so on and so forth. It's almost like kind of like an animalistic thing. It's like bang, they're getting punished for that thing.
So yeah, I would challenge those two elements of what we think human nature is. So like this idea that someone can just be kind of like irredeemably evil.
Yeah.
And they're just dangerous. We just have to lock them away. I don't think that is true.
Right.
And I think even where someone may not get to the point that we want them to, you know, you may even have a situation where someone like isn't admitting what they've done, isn't reflecting on it. And I do believe that like there are ways to make sure that the people around them are safe.
Yeah.
Without like severely harming that individual. And then this other thing about kind of like wanting punishment being human nature. Again, I don't think that's true. And it's understandable that it feels like that. Really, because it's so emotional. And I feel that like when someone does something to me, like my immediate emotional feeling is like, I just want to get that person back.
Yeah.
And I think we act that out in lots of different ways in our day-to-day life. Like,
sure.
I've spoken about this on the podcast, even with like partners or family members. They'll do something to you, and your like immediate feeling is like you just figure out like how to get them back.
Yeah.
And it might be like just with the silent treatment, or it might be with like a little snippy remark.
Yeah.
And even that is like feels so ingrained that it feels like human nature. But I think if you look around us, there are so many like cultural indicators. It's actually so embedded in our culture that you can see how it's got to the extent where it feels like human nature.
Sure. Well, I guess it's also, you know, we've kind of evolved to recognise our own nature and kind of evolve out of it a little bit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
there's plenty of ways that we can change that. Longer conversation. But.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll bring it back. Short, simple answer here. Going back to the main title, is it time for us to get rid of prisons? What's the answer, Oonagh?
Yes, it's time. I've got a list. I'm not going to go through it, but there are...
Oh, please say. If there's literally, like, give on.
There are reforms that there are steps we can make on the way to getting rid of prisons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They look nicely bullet pointed. Do you want to rattle a few off? Because I think anyone listening to this has got to the point now where they might have heard the argument, and actually it'd be great to just kind of like, from your point of view, just to basically...
This is like, lines. I've not thought this through like incredibly in a detailed way, but like this is some stuff that I would like to basically see, and like I would like to see the next Labour government do.
Yeah.
So I think we need a moratorium on prison building. No new prisons, doesn't work.
What?
Moratorium. So we're not going to build any more prisons.
Oh, okay, right.
Commitment to not building any more.
Sure, just getting rid of less prisoners, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Commitment to reducing the prison population, and then each time, like, we see a drop in the prison numbers, we decommission those prison places so they cannot be filled up again.
Could you imagine if prisons became like museums or something, or like places of art or culture?
Well, I think it's Holland, might be wrong. There is a country where they have turned their empty prisons into housing for refugees.
So there are examples where European countries, their criminal justice system
like dramatically reduced.
Really?
Yeah.
God, we haven't even spoken about this. That's
I know,
interesting.
yeah, again,
who's like the best?
like...
So America's the ones on the front line of the discussion to get rid of prisons. Who's on the front line of actually practical stats of going, right, we're definitely decreasing our prison populations.
Holland or Norway.
Really?
Not like knowledgeable on this stuff to say exactly which one. I mean, there are different problems with their systems.
Yes,
but
and I listened to that on the podcast from the guy.
We do talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
So another thing I think we could do is there could be a commitment to reducing the workload of the police. There's a lot of talk about police numbers and cuts at the moment. There's Labour's commitment to have 10,000 new police officers. I think that's a terrible idea. I think what we need to do is fund those services that are those services that are underfunded, that is then putting a strain on the police. So police are ending up going out to like mental health crises.
Sure.
It's things that they can't deal with, they're not trained to deal with, they shouldn't be there in the first place.
Or housing, or educate, whatever. Yeah,
we need to fund those services that are increasing that workload, reduce the police workload that way. I think we could end the imprisonment of under 18-year-olds. There's around about 900 kids in prison.
In the UK, 900 who are under the age of 18.
England and Wales. And that's dropped by 2/3 over the last 10 years. 900 is not a lot of kids. That's like less than...
I think it'd be way more than that.
it's fewer kids than are at my secondary school.
Yeah.
So like, it wouldn't be very hard to invest the resources to give each of those children the support they need.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip the next two because they require a bit more explanation. I think we need to end the use of gang databases, which basically, it's quite a lot of explanation as well. They basically put black people on databases who haven't necessarily committed crimes.
Right.
And then that makes them very vulnerable to like future arrest for minor crimes and then long sentences.
Wow. That's heavy.
Yeah, it's a big issue.
How do I not know that there's something called criminal data? What's it called? Gang
database. There's police databases.
Wow, that's another episode right there.
Yeah.
That's insane.
And I think so we've seen a big sentencing inflation, so sentences are getting longer. I think we need to address that.
Right.
I think we also could renationalise our probation system. So the probation system was privatised in 2015, and this has led to like a huge number of recalls to prison. It's just people who get sent back to prison while they're on probation after having left for things like missing an appointment or being in the wrong area of town. I think we need to end that kind of mandatory 12-month supervision after prison.
Okay.
To stop that cycle of just going back to prison for
Sure.
like stupid little things. So that's like a few actually like practical things I think a government could do right now.
I think that's really interesting. Like to, I think we all can talk about sort of the fancy of, wow, the perfect society where, whatever, ... That sounds like really good, like, I hope you're listening, Theresa May, to this podcast because you should pay attention to all of this. Well, look, I think we'll wrap things up there. But that has been, God, what an education. I feel like, A, I know so little about this, but B, I'm almost kind of concerned how few people probably know as much as you know, and the people that you are educated on this, like why it's not a bigger discussion. Like, why is this not being had? And I take it back to the guy that I was talking to yesterday, who, like I say, was like, well, what else would we do? But, if we didn't have prisons, like, what? People should be running around and, like, not getting punished and all that kind of stuff. And I guess it's just people, like, just being a little bit open-minded about it. And having that debate.
And it's understandable that people feel like that. They feel scared.
Absolutely.
Because that's what we get fed.
Totally.
So it's a conversation that needs to happen.
Hey, it's part of the trifecta, the media, corporation and government. All just that kind of percolating trifecta. Yeah. Well, look, Oonagh, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me and letting me
more than welcome.
bang on for over an hour and a half.
Oh, no, I loved it. I could be here for another hour easily. Just want to give a little shout out to your podcast. What's the name of it?
It's called The Lockdown. You can find it on Novara Media's website, or you can subscribe to Novara Audio on any podcast app.
Amazing. There's also a link in the description of this video if you're watching on YouTube, and also if you're listening to this on any podcast platforms, there'll also be in the description the Twitter handle for for Oonagh's podcast as well, which you can check out. Well, look, guys, anyone who's stuck with us this far, thanks so much for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed it. By all means, feel free to reach out. You can hit me up on Twitter or Instagram at Jack Conan Burke, or if you want to email, you can also do that at info@burkefilms.co.uk. So I just want to say thanks once again, Oonagh, for joining me this week.
Thank you.
And I will catch everyone else next time. All the best. Bye now.